Decades ago, kitchens became playgrounds for ingenuity, making the future feel just a whisk away. From ration hacks that stretched every bite to preservation methods that would baffle even an 80s sci-fi fan, these culinary tricks redefined what was possible. Water bath canning was a method of food preservation that relied on boiling water. The idea was to create a sort of vacuum in jars that would function as a seal. Why would people do this? Well, apparently, this has more than a few benefits. It increases the shelf life by dozens, and it's also really good for foods that are high in their acidic content. As you might know, most fruits come into that, especially citrus ones. The science behind it has a lot to do with microbial inactivation and high temperatures. That sounds fancier than it is, so don't worry. Basically, it's the same process behind sterilizing something, or why people say there's no point to washing your chicken. The boiling water pretty much eradicates any kind of microorganisms that are present in the fruit, and sometimes this can be bacteria, sometimes it can be yeast. At all times, it's unwanted. Once the jars start cooling down after their boiling baptism, the air inside of them starts to shrink and contract. And this is what makes the vacuum. I'm sure none of you are unfamiliar with larding. It's a culinary technique that's centered around strips of pork fat, and it's been a long-standing part of America's hacks history. As far as kitchen shortcuts go, this is probably one of the most recognizable ones. Have you ever been curious as to why larding works the way it does, though? Once the larding needle is used to insert it into the cut of meat, what happens is that the inserted fat starts to melt. This reduces the overall moisture loss in the cut of meat and gives you a juicier cut overall, and the fat also helps to prevent it from drying too much and shrinking. Fat carries lots of flavor, and it also helps enhance the flavor that's already there, on top of making the cut of meat more tender. Lots of doctors have thought that lard isn't really the best thing for your cholesterol, though, and too much consumption of it has been linked to heart issues. On the other hand, dry aging is something that's done in a pretty regulated environment. If you're the type that likes to store their food in those perfectly coordinated and controlled spaces like a root cellar, then you'll probably enjoy this. It requires a specific temperature, airflow, and humidity. When people dry age meat, it's usually to help prevent the loss of moisture and make sure that the flavors that are already there get more concentrated. I won't say it enhances those flavors as well as, say, something like larding does, but it definitely makes them more prominent. It also helps to make the meat softer, and if you've ever noticed this, meat that's been dry-aged tends to have this extra hard exterior to it for some reason. This is because after the process, a hardened crust tends to form, which chefs actually trim before cooking. This crust is there to help protect the meat from being spoilt by filthy microbes or getting spoilt early on. You've probably seen it being used for steaks or lean cuts of red meat a lot, and if you're ever looking for more dry aging inspo, at least there are always things like Hell's Kitchen or MasterChef USA. Smoking fish and salt curing it is a very age-old technique. This is a traditional preservation method that's arguably one of the oldest ones on the list so far. So, you see, the good thing about salt is that it's really fantastic at drawing moisture out of things. The same goes for fish, and this process is actually called osmosis. In function, it works exactly how that crust on the exterior of the meat with dry aging does. It helps to prevent any kind of unwanted microorganisms from settling down on your catch of the day, and also helps get rid of the little critters that grow and contribute to the rate at which your fish spoils. Also, fish are notorious for being extremely perishable, and salt curing actually helps to make the proteins in the salt a lot more firm. It gives them stability thanks to changing the way they're structured. This helps to not only increase the shelf life of the fish, but also helps to boost the flavor. You can do either cold smoking or hot smoking, but most people tend to go for cold smoking because it gives those smoky flavors to the fish without really cooking it. Hot cooking does reduce moisture a lot, and it also makes sure there's no bacteria to worry about, but you get an overall flakier fish. Bread proofing, especially in cloth-lined baskets that people used to refer to as bannetons, was one of the cutest things to do before your weekly picnic. In the hands of someone who knows what they are doing, though, like an artisan bread maker, this is actually a weapon that helps bring that loaf of bread closer and closer to a 10 out of 10. The cloth here helps to support the dough as it starts to rise, and this helps the dough from not spreading or collapsing. You get a taller loaf and one with a better overall structure. Of course, there's also some very deeply appreciated moisture control going on here. The cloth tends to absorb any excess moisture from the dough, giving you a drier layer on the outside, but it helps the bread keep its shape because if this didn't happen, there would be chances of an uneven outside layer. Also, we all know how much crumb quality helps bread. With bread proofing, the bread's crumbs retain their texture, and the small support they get from the cloth actually helps them to stay more together, giving you an overall better crumb texture. Artisan bread makers have been using this technique for centuries now to dish out some pretty amazing bread loaves, and I think it's definitely worth the shot at home too. The history of cooking in a salt crust is actually far too long for a video like this. I mean, it could be its own separate essay, but I'll try my best to wrap it up for you in a neat little bow. Basically, this hack was ahead of its time by a few millennia, which I think is definitely a world record of some sort. It happened in places with massive amounts of salt reserves, right? The Mediterranean, some parts of Southeast Asia, areas like that. Lots of cooks found that once you put whatever you were working with in a mixture of salt and water, it almost protected it. The historical aspect of this is that even ancient Greeks and Romans used salt crust cooking, especially for things like fish. Interestingly enough, here, salt was seen as a luxury item that would mean you were very well off in life or even had a more sophisticated and refined palate. In Asia, specifically in Chinese cuisine, it was actually referred to as beggar's chicken. It wasn't really given the same prestige reputation it got in Greece. You might have heard of dishes like salt-baked chicken or salt-crusted beef and lamb or even sea bass before, and it's still something that you can easily ask for and find in restaurants today. Hot stone cooking is also arguably one of the oldest methods of preparing your food, and this doesn't even go back to just a few thousand years. It actually goes back to prehistoric times. As far as being ahead of the curve goes, even salt crust cooking has to take a back seat here. The earliest version of humankind was quite reliant on using things like heated stones. You'd get a fire going with the boys and throw a few stones in there for old time's sake. In indigenous cultures in places like North America and the Pacific Islands, and even Asia, hot stone techniques were used to steam and roast food, and things like Hawaiian imu and Polynesian umu are examples of offshoots of this. It was the earliest form of stone and heat-based cooking, and that's where the idea for earth ovens and heating water in hollowed-out logs came from as well. Hot stone cooking isn't something that people do in modern restaurants anymore, but some of them do it because they want to add some dramatic flair, some cinema to the experience. A lot of restaurants like this also offer you hot stones at the table to cook your food with, making it a much more interactive dining experience overall. Some stuff you might have seen before that uses hot stone cooking can look like, for example, Korean bibimbap or hot stone steaks. Cooking with banana leaves and corn husks is a really traditional method that's used by a lot of different cultures right now and has been used by a lot of different kinds of people in the past, too. The idea here is to take advantage of the tropical and agricultural regions in which materials like these are really concentrated. Banana leaves work as a natural wrapper and serve a lot of practical purposes. Indigenous origins, like cultures in Mesoamerica, also used corn husks for things like tamales, and they used them to roast, grill, and steam. So, the practical effort of this is that these plant wrappers are really biodegradable, unlike plastic alternatives. They're also super abundant, and they double as food storage. This is why people with an agricultural nomadic lifestyle and focus in society would adopt this and really just spam it with every dish they could. Whether it's lau lau or tamales or even puto bumbong, all cultural dishes that you can find in America today using these same techniques, you can get a pretty good kick out of cooking with some banana leaves and corn husks. They get you some pretty nice moisture retention and even cooking, as well as helping keep flavors in and avoiding natural juice from leaking out. Sun drying doesn't just work for your laundry. Apparently, according to this ancient hack, it also works for your fruit. Early societies discovered that exposing their sun to the fruit and the air could not only extend the shelf life of it by years and years, but it would also help to make them a lot more resistant to getting spoiled. This was a technique that had been practiced in many climates and cultures before it found its way to American soil. Today, in our country, it's used primarily in rural areas and places that are far removed from urban hubs or stores, and so they need to make sure that their fruits don't go to waste. The extension this gives to something's regular lifespan is no joke. You really can make your fruit last a lot longer this way. Interestingly enough, it was the Egyptians who were the first people that figured out that drying your fruit this way was so effective. All fruit counts, to be honest. Figs, grapes, oranges, anything can work with this. More fancy places have dehydrators, as that's the industry norm in modern times, but lots of people still appreciate what the sun can do for them too. This is one that's really popular in the South in America too. I'm sure you're all very familiar with dry rub marinades and what they do for you, as well as the sheer difference in a steak that's been through a good spice rub a few times and a dry one. You take your favorite spices, herbs, and any kind of ingredients you like, mix them all together, and rub it on the surface of the food. It honestly originated here from indigenous tribes who would use chili powder and smoked paprika to help flavor the meat of the game they would hunt. This pretty much laid the foundation for barbecue marinades and rubs as we know them today, and that's just one more thing you can thank indigenous people for. Dry rub marinades are the lifeblood of so many menus, restaurants, and cuisines that it's almost impossible to think life at some point continued without this. I mean, sure, lots of people have always used mixes of spices and seasoning, so you might be asking what really constitutes a marinade? The amount of spices and herbs you throw in there? How well is it mixed? Are there any specific ingredients you don't ever want to miss? I'd say that anything that can be used to coat and season the meat you're working with can count as a spice blend, but a dry rub marinade is specifically for rubbing on the surfaces of the meat and uses dry spices. You might have seen things like American barbecue ribs or tandoori chicken in Indian restaurants use stuff like this. Honestly, it works pretty damn well, if you ask me. Steakhouses even use simple blends of salt or garlic powder and some dried herbs, rubbing them onto steaks before they're grilled and pan-served. Animal fat for cooking is an American cornerstone, and that's not something anyone can deny. It's something that shaped our culinary traditions and was enjoyed by settlers, colonialists, indigenous people, enslaved African American communities, and Native Americans alike. Basically, everyone's made some memories with this. In Native American traditions, the idea was to use animal fats like bear grease and the tallow of a bison for seasoning, preservation, or cooking. That bison tallow would most likely get mixed with berries and dried meat, and most of them survived off of things like pemmican. In early America, a lot of the settlers that were European brought their traditions of beef tallow and fried and baked most of what they were cooking with this. A lot of these fats were really important to cooking and culinary tradition because they also worked as preservatives, and this was well before refrigeration. Enslaved communities of African Americans would most often supplement their own rations with animal fats and use them for seasoning and adding extra nutrition. A lot of these applications of animal fat were really important to the day-to-day lifestyle of these people, and without it, we would have missed out on a lot of good food collectively. Now, layering in casseroles is something we all know well enough in our bones. I think most people just start their teenage years with a profound understanding of how this works. Years of watching your mom layer them up Sunday after Sunday will do that to you. In fact, most homes, the dad manages just as well. Guess he learned through observation too, huh? Anyway, layered dishes were something that were never really inherent to American cooking. They have their roots in European cuisine and styles of cooking, which were originally brought on by early European settlers. British dishes like shepherd's pie and gratins were always layered, and that's where American people picked up yet another tradition from. Layering in casseroles wasn't something that became mainstream knowledge in the 50s and 60s either, despite how the internet will constantly tell you how those were the golden days of casseroles. It was a technique that started in rural communities in the 1800s because it let cooks combine a small amount of several ingredients like vegetables and meat, as well as leftovers, and mix them into one dish. This way, you wouldn't rely too much on one thing or the other. The casserole boom certainly helped, but people have been layering and stacking for ages now. Recycling bread also isn't really something Americans are new to by any means. During the Great Depression, this was a show of spirit and a sign of how the era was full of resourceful, crafty, and determined people who wouldn't go down to the circumstances. While that may sound like looking back at it in a rose-tinted glasses sort of way, it is true, since hacks like recycling bread crusts prove that lots of amazing hacks came around during the Depression. Bread was a staple food and a dietary pillar of many communities for many centuries. It's always been like that, and far after we're gone and YouTube shuts down, it'll probably still be like that. The Great Depression was a period of extreme poverty for the country, and it led to people all around embracing a let nothing go to waste type of mentality. Bread, even if it was stale, was recycled constantly. People would use the crumbs as coating, as fillers. They would use it as a binding agent. Even women's magazines, church cookbooks, and newsletters in neighborhoods started showing you ideas for reusing bread crusts and seeing what helps and what doesn't. It was like a collective effort to find ways to make sure your bread wouldn't go to waste, and I honestly think it helped a lot. So what reason could you possibly have to scald your milk? A lot more than you'd think, and honestly, less than there should be. Scalding milk was something people used to do much before the 20th century, and the reason they stopped afterwards was only because everyone finally awoke to the majesty of pasteurization. Scalding milk was basically just heating it to a smidgen below the boiling point, and it was done to basically sterilize the milk. Not only did you want to extend the shelf life, you also really wanted to kill the bacteria. Before pasteurization, the second reason was mostly why people resort to tactics like scalding their milk. But during the Depression, it was the first benefit that drove people to adopt this hack once again. People really wanted to make sure their milk wasn't spoiling more quickly than it should, and they also wanted to make sure that they'd make use of every drop they could. Urban homes might have found uses for scalding and baking as well, since it would help increase the rise of the bread and give it a better texture, but everywhere else? Folks were just trying to get their milk to last a day longer. It would help that this could be done on an open fire, though you'd have to develop a knack for the timing since you didn't want to actually end up boiling the milk. Cooking with whey is also something that really helps because whey is basically the byproduct you get when you make cheese or strain yogurt. It's that little liquid that's super rich in proteins, minerals, and all kinds of vitamins. During the Depression, people started to really take to cooking with whey because it was better than using their other reserves, ingredients, and their already low stash of oil. A lot of cultural roots also tie into the practice of cooking with whey, because a lot of cultures in America have had recorded histories of how they would use to cook with whey. German, Scandinavian, and Italian cuisines, in specific, use a lot of it in their soups and breads, and during the Depression, when church cookbooks, community newsletters, and the sharing of culinary information were getting really common, lots of people who were Americans from the get-go learnt about this technique as well. People would use it to bake, but they could also use it with rice, oatmeal, and other kinds of grains. Any kind of whey that was left over was given to livestock because, well, you'd obviously want to make sure they were okay and also getting fattened up. Smoking herbs is a very important tradition for a lot of communities and cultures in America. As far as ancient practices go, this is pretty much as vintage as it gets. It's used spiritually, recreationally, and as well as for medical purposes. Lots of people would even use it to smoke, like, the way you'd smoke a cigarette. It was an alternative to tobacco smoking because it was seen as healthier. And no, people used more herbs and plants than just marijuana before your mind immediately goes there. Indigenous people and several Native American tribes would use herbal smoking blends in rituals, ceremonies, and several practices that were passed down from community to community, generation to generation. Sweetgrass, sage, and tobacco were seen as helpful herbs that could cleanse spaces, help promote well-being, and take care of your system. And they were believed to work like a detox. Lots of herbs, like frankincense, myrrh, and cannabis as well, were burnt and smoked for their very therapeutic effects. Modern variants of this look like a rise in herbal smoking blends and the excessive use and popularity of lavender. See, that was one herb that people almost always used, and mostly because it was so good for your sleep. Mullein was another that was really helpful for your lungs because of its soothing effect. Maybe try some on your own. You might be surprised what's growing in the ground. Pickling in ceramic rocks was a preservation hack that actually goes back so many centuries. It's insane that people were able to pick this stuff up about the plants and vegetables growing around them. The method pretty much relies on fermentation and brining. It's meant to preserve vegetables, meats, and different kinds of fruits, as well as help boost the flavor and extend the shelf life. It's also something that just became really popular in a lot of cultures thanks to the artistic value of it as well. I mean, who doesn't like a pretty-looking ceramic vessel on their shelf, right? If it's got some practical function to it, that makes it even better, but it can just sit there and look pretty too. Kind of the same deal you have with jackets and cargo pants, isn't it? Do you need all those zips and pockets? It's never even cold enough that you end up using the full functionality of your jacket either. The ceramic vessel is pretty similar. Jokes aside, it's something that would work wonderfully well as a way to help extend the life of fruits and supplies, and it was something that nomadic people here relied on heavily. Butter making at home. A comfy way to spend your Saturday learning a new skill or a very odd and interesting flex for your next Hinge Tinder sleepover. Butter making was introduced to us thanks to European settlers who brought along with them dairy cows as well as methods on how to churn milk into butter. This was done both for cooking and preservation, and it was something that dated back to the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 19th century, the introduction of the dash churn, which was pretty much just a very simple vessel made of wood with a plunger, made it a lot easier to churn butter. Over time, this became the most common method people would use in their homes on how to do it. Home dairying really became a thing in rural America because homes that could make their own butter were often seen as self-sufficient. Homemakers even started to make it a point of pride and a bit of neighborly competition. I guess there are a lot more worse things in hindsight you can compete and argue over than who can make the best butter at home. So, to do it, you need fresh cream with a high fat content, some salt for flavor, and a traditional churner like a stand mixer, food processor, mason jar, barrel, paddle, or dash. You just prepare the cream, let it come to room temperature, and you whisk the cream until the butterfat and buttermilk are separated. Mind you, this takes a lot of work, so you'll really have to work on your forearm and wrist endurance. I guess you can skip the gym that day, huh? You might think cooking in clay rice pots is a little weird, but it's something that actually gets a lot of traction across the entire world, and especially in America as well. Clay pots are something that people have been using for millennia, and it's exactly because they're so good at retaining heat and cooking food evenly that they became so popular. Archaeological evidence would even tell you that ancient civilizations like the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia also used clay pots, and they're not really wrong on that count either. Clay pot rice cooking is something that was brought to America thanks to Chinese traditionalist immigrants who brought a lot of their culture's tips and tricks along with them. It was really common to see clay pot cooking being performed in Chinatowns and neighborhoods with an extremely dense population of Chinese Americans. In recent times, there's been a resurgence of clay pot rice cooking. A lot of people are pretty fed up with hearing about some environmental disaster every day and how the world is coming to an end. The fear-mongering is at an all-time high, and people are looking for something that can help them out with their own carbon footprint. Wrapping meat in a damp newspaper is a pretty old-fashioned trick. I'll admit, I wasn't expecting to see this one here. It's something you would really only see in the middle of 20th century America, and it's not something that people have used since even in campfires. The idea here was to use it as a way to keep meat cool when refrigeration just was not an option or wasn't available. Damp newspaper was also doubling as an insulating layer, so that would help avoid spoilage. Outdoor cooking methods became a lot more popular during the Depression and the 2 or 3 decades right after that, because gas and electricity were two things people couldn't save enough on, no matter how many corners they ended up cutting to make those bills just a bit easier to pay. Wrapping meat in damp newspaper wasn't just a way to preserve it. It also made it really portable, and people would even layer it up with wax paper or wet burlap. People would wrap these up and place them near fires because the dampness helped it not get burnt and actually made sure it was cooking evenly, if you can believe it. I guess those newspapers have a lot more uses than we originally gave them credit for. Tandoori cooking is something that shows you the ingenuity of different cultures and just how much they have to bring to the table. It's something that combines open flame cooking, which is something that a lot of Americans might be familiar with themselves with classic spice blends, marinades, and dry rubs from the subcontinent. Never had your meat done right? You might need to give tandoori cooking a good shot. You might be surprised at what you end up with. I know a lot of us have probably even seen it in restaurants and Indian joints by now, but the trick here is actually really interesting. You take the intense heat of the tandoor, which is fantastic for sealing in juices and really makes ample use of fine cuts of meat. Then you mix that in with spice rubs that just know how to accentuate those smoky flavors the tandoor's mixing into the meat even better. It's also got a lot of health benefits too. Tandoori cooking doesn't take any kind of oil, which is something we Americans really need to get off of anyway. Okay, it takes a bit of oil, but it's almost too little to notice. Plus, it's also just quicker than a stove. It's also stupidly versatile. The same tandoor that prepares your chicken tikka masala also prepares your naan bread, and that's one that Indians will always have on us, I'm afraid. Freezing leftover wine is again something that lots of people would do and is something that's actually gotten more and more popular as time has gone on. Historically, wine preservation often looked like things like corking, decanting, or just keeping it in a damp cellar, but people took it a step further when they decided to try freezing wine for future cooking. Wine as a commodity has been a staple of America since, I think, the very beginning. I mean, there's arguably no drink that's more romantic. You could say Europeans brought it over, but I think at this point, wine is probably one of the few things that the United States and the United Kingdom can agree on happily. So let's not open a can of worms where there's no need to. Portion control was also something that was a benefit of freezing wine. You could freeze wine in ice cube trays or tiny containers. Wine could also be frozen for so many months, and it could be really convenient to do that. You could have cooking sessions that relied on wine, like bechamel sauces, without the added inconvenience of going to the store and running for one. So, cooking with earth ovens, also known as pit ovens, is one of the most primitive methods of cooking that we've ever had. It was something that was used by indigenous peoples across the globe for centuries, but is something that really peaked in America thanks to the sheer amount of space for this method. What I mean is, there was a lot of good ground to make earth ovens out of. The practice of cooking with them goes back so many centuries that it's actually hard to pinpoint when the practice originated. Archaeologists have found sites that house very old ovens in the United States, though, particularly in places like California, the Great Plains, and the general Southeast. The process is also pretty interesting. First, you dig the pit, then prepare the fire, which could go on for several hours, and then you would prepare the food. The meat might be marinated, or the vegetables might be boiled or wrapped in leaves, and then, once the stones in the pit were hot enough, they would be placed around the edges of the pit with the food at the center. Would you ever give this a shot and try your potluck recipes in an earth oven? I think it sounds super interesting. Broth making with animal bones has been a culinary practice of many people across several centuries in North America. It's also something that makes sure you get the most use out of the animal. So guess what time period this was really popular in? That's right, the 30s with the ever-so-infamous Great Depression. This technique was something that ensured you extracted all the collagen, minerals, and valuable nutrition from bones, and even the selection of the bones was important for this reason. You would typically use bison or deer bones, but people would take it a step further. They wouldn't just make their broths with it, they'd also make kitchen utensils, spoons, and knives out of antlers and horns. I guess there's a lot more you can get out of a skeleton than I ever imagined. We're going to end the list with an account of how indigenous people often use natural sweeteners with their food, and the Ojibwe were one of the most famous tribes for this. They were very present throughout places like Wisconsin and Minnesota, and they have a deep connection to the natural resources they relied on. Sweeteners like maple sugar, thanks to tapping trees, wild honey, the extracts from berries and fruits, and evaporating maple sap were all ways that the Ojibwe frequently used to add a bit of personality and depth of flavor to their dishes. Nowadays, we're pretty used to sweeteners already being jam-packed into whatever we're eating, but it definitely didn't used to be that way, and I think we could benefit from a bit more organic sweetening in our lives. So, you really want that aesthetically perfect slice of cake, right? The one that looks like it's right out of a TV ad? The one that just looks wonderfully symmetrical and like it was cut by a pro? You can't get that with a knife, despite what the TV shows. We've all been there, friend. I'll let you in on a little secret too. They probably don't use knives either. When you start with a knife, especially if the blade is dull or blunt, then the pressure that the knife gives off might cause some pretty uneven compression throughout the cake. This can happen because of the knife or just you using too much force, but whatever the cause, you get uneven slices as a result. However, you don't get this problem with a string line. Know why? String lines create uniform pressure across the entire surface of the cake. You can pull the cake through the cake without much force either, unlike a knife, where you'd kind of have to try to push down. These two factors make string lines almost irreplaceable when it comes to slicing cake, because it means you get the most even slice with the least amount of force. Also, have you ever noticed the way cake sticks to knives? Strings don't really have that problem because of their thinness. Knives, on the other hand, are prone to dragging a lot of the cake with them. So, putting your fruits in sugar to preserve them is an age-old trick that's been around forever. Are you interested in the know-how, though? Because it's actually a lot of neat little stuff working together to make sure you can get 1 or 2 days more out of that banana. So, first, we need to talk about a little something called osmotic pressure. Sugar tends to make an environment with a high amount of osmotic pressure, and this really draws water out of microbial cells, which includes things like bacteria and yeast. Microbes basically need their daily 8 glasses of water to live, or they'll die, and unlike us, they can't substitute that for a Coke and a cigarette. Sugar binds with molecules in water, and it robs those microorganisms of what they need to live. Pretty brutal, right? That's not sweet at all. I bet you didn't know how much sugar reduces it either, and your overall water activity actually goes below 0.85 plus. It also works as an antioxidant. What does that mean? Basically, the enzymes that are responsible for browning your fruit, ruining that perfectly ripe taste, sugar gets rid of that. All in all, it's your go-to solution for making your fruits last longer, look better, and taste fresher also. Just be cleaner overall. Really just a pit stop for your fruit basket. Since the theme of the list so far seems to be hacks that make kitchen life easier and the life of things in the kitchen longer, a good one to talk about now is how to freshen up those limp vegetables. The ones that have more or less wilted away now and are just sitting there in your inventory, dying out, taking up space, not even being used because they seem to be past that stage. Things like lettuce can easily be brought back to life though. With some scissor work, ice water, and just a little bit of time, they are good as new. All you need to do is get rid of the parts you do not need, basically trim areas that are too wilted. Then just place it in a large bowl of ice water, pat it dry, and continue using as you would. It works literally every time. In the world of early American survival foods, sometimes simplicity and ingenuity combine to create something extraordinary. The Cherokee, for example, had a tradition of making bean bread, a dish that was as much practical as it was essential. Beans were a cornerstone of their diet, providing a protein-rich food source that could be preserved and stored for long periods. Combined with cornmeal, this humble bread became an important way to stretch available resources. To prepare it, beans were cooked, mashed, and mixed with cornmeal, then baked or steamed to form a dense, filling loaf. While the ingredients were simple, the result was a bread that could keep you going through long winters or tough times. Once made, it could last for days and, like many traditional foods, could be adapted based on what was available. For the Cherokee, bean bread represented the resourcefulness of their people, a food that could be shared, preserved, and passed down through generations. Beans are rich in fiber, making this bread not just a source of calories, but a natural way to stay regular. It's the original comfort food, hearty, satisfying, and full of wisdom that stood the test of time. Salt is really good at quickly cleaning your iron pans. This happens for a few reasons, but 2 of them are that salt just happens to be inherently very abrasive, and it's also very good at degreasing. This helps food that's stuck on the pan and any grease that also won't go away to come off easily. You don't want to be damaging the surface of your pan after all. Why is salt like that though? Salt happens to be really coarse, and that makes it really good for situations where you would need an abrasive. Sprinkle just a little bit on a hot pan with a bit of leftover oil and start scrubbing with a cloth. You'll see the difference almost immediately, and that's all thanks to the coarseness of salt. Why does salt work as a degreaser? Well, that's because when you use it alongside heat, salt changes its properties a little, as most things do when they come into contact with heat. Now, salt can help to absorb and break down greasy surfaces because it helps draw that grease away. Salt has a lot of good absorption properties too. It's really good at taking away moisture from other liquids and oils. It's also good for preventing some rust, but that's a little side tip I'm including for free. To support your cutting board and prevent injuries, grandmas would often place a damp cloth or paper towel underneath to stop it from slipping. This is something they would often do when teaching their family or grandchildren to handle knife work, usually when they would first begin drilling cooking 101 lessons into their skull. It makes no sense to introduce someone to the kitchen if they end up cutting themselves and never wanting to cook again. Small countermeasures like this went a long way, both in preserving all 10 of your fingers and your budding interest in making food. Also, everybody wants the cool knife skills, so they often tend to rush into that aspect. You would be surprised at how often people manage to hurt themselves with their own utensils. Around 350,000 people a year are injured by kitchen knives in America, and if placing a damp cloth gets that number down, then it is a pretty simple idea to put into practice. When life gives you choke cherries, a fruit so tart it makes lemons look sweet, you don't eat them raw. Instead, you turn them into something extraordinary, like choke cherry syrup. For indigenous peoples and early settlers, it was a clever way to preserve the fruit and make use of a wild harvest. Choke cherries, native to North America, were boiled down with water and sometimes sweetened with honey or sugar to create a thick, tangy syrup. This process concentrated the flavor and ensured the fruit could last far beyond its brief season. The syrup could then be stored in jars or crocks, providing a burst of flavor during the colder months when fresh fruit was scarce. Nutritionally, choke cherries were small but mighty. Packed with antioxidants and vitamins, they offered a health boost that paired nicely with their versatility. The syrup could be drizzled on bread, mixed into porridge, or even used as a glaze for meat. Culturally, choke cherries held deep importance for many indigenous tribes. They were also used as medicine. The bark and seeds were used in remedies, and the fruit itself was seen as a gift from the land. The name choke cherry comes from the fruit's astringency, which can literally make your throat tighten if eaten raw. Thankfully, with a little ingenuity and a lot of syrup, they became one of the sweetest survival foods in history. Before the days of freezers and two-door fridges, we had cold cellars, which you may also have heard being referred to as root cellars. For centuries, this was pretty much the cornerstone of not just America, but global society as a whole on how to preserve their food. Why was that, though? Most modern freezers actually try to replicate the environments people had in cold cellars. The temperatures you'd find in these frosty rooms would go down to 30 degrees and 50 degrees, and that meant that enzymatic activity, the same thing we just discussed that browns your bananas bad, goes down heavily in vegetables and fruits. Cold temperatures basically do the same for microbes too. Stunted growth is bad for anyone, not just kids that don't drink their milk. Plus, cold cellars have really high levels of humidity. Moisture retention is a big deal for these things, you know. You don't give them enough of that, they're liable to die way before they need to. Yet you've also heard that too much of the stuff is bad for you. You've probably heard your parents say not to keep your apples too close or around too much air, or keep your onions separate. Well, that's because of ethylene gas. With too much moisture and not enough ventilation, the buildup of this gas and the release of it causes a lot of nasty cross-contamination. Basically, you don't want your fruits being bad neighbors, and cold cellars were such a nice neighborhood too. Cloth bags can actually help your cheese age just right, and I bet that sounds like a really weird mix to you, but it's as legitimate as a mix can be. The right conditions for aging all happen inside the wonderful confines of a cloth bag, so you have that for one. Basically, to age cheese and to age it properly, you need 3 different things. You need moisture that's regulated, and you need a lot of air circulation. None of that means anything if your environment isn't clean, so you need to be able to prevent contamination as well as you can. Moisture regulation is really important because as it keeps aging, then cheese starts losing moisture. Cloth bags, on the other hand, are made of really breathable material and help moisture to evaporate a bit more slowly so that the cheese doesn't get too dry. Cheese aging also helps keep air balanced since the cloth bag is really porous. All those tiny little openings help air to flow around the cheese, which you really need for the health of the rind. It helps for those helpful little bacteria and molds that you find on cheese to grow. Some of those microorganisms don't deserve to die in a heat death. They make your burger a lot better. Third of all, the bag itself just works as a natural barrier against any kind of dirty substance, insect, or material. All in all, you get a perfect vibe for your cheese. When you deal with stuff like peppers or jalapenos, you are bound to get your hands smothered in chili oil. This is especially a pain if you are sensitive and sneeze easily, or if you are clumsy and are prone to touching your eyes with those same hands, both of which are some pretty inconvenient circumstances, especially in the middle of cooking. Luckily, most home chefs' grandmas knew how to work around this one too. Rubbing your hands with oil, like coconut, olive, or canola oil, removes chili oil from your skin. You might be wondering what magic oil has that water does not. What makes it particularly suited for getting rid of chili residue from your hands is that peppers tend to be more soluble in fat than water. A nice, even coating of the stuff can go a long way when it comes to protecting your skin, eyes, and your sanity while handling some heavy heat ingredients. Before the age of refrigeration, preserving vegetables was a matter of survival. Salt pickles were a staple on American homesteads, a simple yet effective way to keep food from spoiling. The technique is straightforward. Vegetables, typically cucumbers, are submerged in brine, allowing the salt to draw out moisture and create a barrier against harmful bacteria. This not only extended the shelf life of the produce, but also added a tangy, salty flavor that made them a beloved side dish. Pickling was crucial for settlers who faced long winters or periods of isolation. Early pioneers pickled everything from cabbage to beans, storing them in large crocks that would last throughout the year. Salt pickles were an affordable and practical solution, as salt was readily available and the process didn't require fancy tools or complex ingredients. Beyond their practical value, salt pickles became a cultural touchstone. They were served at almost every meal, especially during harvest time when fresh produce was abundant. In terms of nutrition, pickles provided a dose of probiotics from the fermentation process, which helped support gut health. They were also a great source of hydration, thanks to the brine. So, no one's a stranger to the process of larding, but I think a lot of us just follow these things because they're generational, tried and tested tips and tricks we know work. Why do they work, though? Well, if you've ever played FIFA or a Dragon Age game, then you know the concept of a defender or a tank. Lard kind of acts like that. It makes a protective barrier of fat, which melts away when you cook. But when you just coat it, it seals it from any outside exposure. This helps oxidation basically never happen, which means you don't get any nasty-smelling meat or spoilage. Meat needs to be juicy too, though. Fat helps keep a lot of that water and moisture in, because who likes their steak dry? Plus, did you know some organisms that spoil your stuff actually really just get off of air? Lard really helps choke them out. When we were living in colonial times and people were still immigrating to the South and West, larded meats were even a sign of luxury and were a big part of our culture. It was impossible to make those long treks without a supply of properly preserved and fresh meat. Potatoes are really starchy, and this gives them a lot of benefits outside the kitchen and your plate of food too. It helps them take away any kind of excess salt from your dish by just making sure that you don't have excessive moisture. As we have gone through so many times in this video already, the moisture amount in your food needs to be just right for a lot of things to work, as they ideally should. Potatoes, being composed almost entirely of starch, have a massive capacity for absorbing all kinds of liquids. You put raw potatoes into some kind of soup, stew, or sauce, and just watch as it takes away the liquid and salt. Most of the salty liquid gets absorbed by the potatoes thanks to a process known as osmosis. This is what happens when liquids or water move from one object to another to balance out the overall concentrations. The starches of the potato help to make a membrane that helps to draw the liquid into the potato. Plus, besides just that, potatoes are really good at diluting salt. Why does this help? It helps to keep the salt-to-food ratio low, which ensures that your steak or burger is just the right amount of bitter and not overpoweringly so. All in all, a little potatoes on the side have more benefits than you'd initially expect. Curing with nitrates has been another way of preserving meat. They did 3 things, and they did them really well. Those were preserving your meat's color, killing off any bacteria, and enhancing flavor. Pretty good all-rounder, right? Turns out, we used to deal with a pretty nasty illness known as botulism, which happened thanks to the rampant growth of Clostridium botulinum in meat. Lots to pronounce, but the gist of it is that this foodborne illness goes bye-bye when you cure meat with nitrates. Myoglobin in meat reacts with nitrates to overall just wipe out scores of bacteria. It's a real bloodbath if you look at it through a microscope, really. What's up with the color thing, though? Nitrates can actually help keep your ham, bacon, or whatever it is looking really vibrant and fresh, and that's all because it's a damn good curing agent. Oxidation is a real pain, and it can happen to you or any food you love. Nitrates have become so common now that we actually can't tell they enhance flavor anymore, but they do. Try having meat with none of that stuff put in. You'll immediately be able to tell the difference. It's because nitrites break nitric oxide down and form flavor compounds with amino acids in meat. This basically is what enhances its umami flavor and is something that industries keep trying to do to push certain flavor profiles forward. They're after you. Sugar has some pretty interesting interactions with other things too, not just bread. You can grease pans with some sugar to coat your baked goods too, but this time in a crunchy and sweet outer crust. If you are the type of person who really enjoys having their food crunchy or at least have some kind of crisp to it, then this is a hack for you. This goes with anything: pies, cakes, muffins, or even non-baked options like toast. You do not even have to add too much sugar, as it works perfectly fine with just a few tablespoons, and the slight cooking gives it a much stronger flavor in addition to the crust. Long before sugar was king, nature had already perfected its sweetest invention, honey. And when stored in its original waxy packaging, the honeycomb, it was practically immortal. Archaeologists have even uncovered honey thousands of years old in Egyptian tombs, still safe to eat. The secret lies in the honeycomb itself. Beeswax seals the honey, protecting it from air and moisture. Combined with honey's naturally low water content and antibacterial properties, it creates an environment where bacteria just can't survive, making it nature's edible time capsule. For early Americans, sealed honeycomb was an essential. Colonists, Native Americans, and pioneers used honey for everything from baking to soothing sore throats. It was a rare treat that could last indefinitely, making it invaluable for long winters or journeys. The wax could be chewed like gum, and any leftover wax was sometimes used for candles. And while it didn't require any fancy preparation, sealed honeycomb offered dense calories, trace nutrients, and natural sweetness. So this one might really be a wonder for you, but it actually does work, both in theory and execution. Using bread to revive hardened sugar is a classic kitchen hack that basically just plays around a little bit with science to get some much-needed utility in the kitchen. So, people weren't just using sugar, they had substituted it with brown sugar, and that really was prone to hardening a lot. It wasn't good at keeping its moisture, especially since brown sugar had a decent amount of molasses. Those had water content, but it would pretty much evaporate and cause the bits of sugar to lump together. Now, the issue here seems to be that we don't have enough water to keep things going around here, right? Bread, conveniently enough, has an incredible amount of water content. The moisture in bread is around 35 to 45%, and when you put that up against hardened sugar, the difference comparatively is immense. The process by which you take advantage of all this is called diffusion. It helps water molecules move from a densely packed surface like the bread to a place that's missing water. Think of it like a revive in a Call of Duty game. Once you put that bread in an airtight container with the sugar, the vapor the bread gives off naturally starts diffusing into the sugar, and that in turn softens. Pretty neat, right? Onions are often known as the perfect sidekick to a burger, a great pizza topping, an incredible addition to most curry-based dishes when caramelized, and of course, the star ingredient in the American favorite, fried onion rings. Yet in their base form, they are also known for having one heck of a smell. Onions can be pretty pungent and have a very strong flavor, which is often a bit too overbearing for some people. You can navigate your way around this and turn it into something much easier to digest by just soaking it in cold water for a while. By a while, we mean no longer than 5 to 10 minutes, as anything more than that will weaken the flavor too much. If your goal is to reduce the strong odor and soften the flavor, you'll be surprised at how effective an ice bath is for onions. Centuries before the invention of tortillas, tamales, or even nachos, Native American cultures were already perfecting the art of using corn in ways that made it both more digestible and more durable. The technique used was nixtamalization. By soaking and cooking corn kernels in an alkaline solution, usually lime water, the process released essential nutrients and made corn easier to grind into masa, the base for many beloved dishes. Masa isn't just any dough, it's corn transformed through fermentation, a key to both its preservation and nutritional benefits. Once treated, it could be stored for several days or dried for longer preservation, ensuring a steady food source during the harvest season. This made it the ultimate survival food long before commercial kitchens got their hands on it. Masa represented more than sustenance. It was a symbol of resourcefulness and the deep relationship between people and the land. It was the foundation of countless recipes across North and South America, linking indigenous communities across vast regions. So I'm sure you've seen this in movies before, but clay pot cooling was a real thing. It's a pretty vintage cooling technique, but it just takes some smart advantage of the properties of clay. Since clay happens to be a material with more pores than it knows what to do with, water tends to reach the outer surface easily enough. Imagine really tiny channels of water that give a very slow but steady supply of water to the inside surface. Since the water is ultimately so little, though, it tends to evaporate and create an environment where it absorbs heat and turns to a vapor, something you may or may not know as the endothermic process. This evaporation is pretty much what creates a lower temperature and humidity inside the pot and helps create that natural refrigerator effect that made this such a genius way of preserving everything and anything all inside an easily transportable and carryable pot. This is still an active tradition in many parts of the world, but in America, historically, settlers used pots to keep waters and fruits cold and fresh before ice boxes were ever a thing. Storing herbs in an ice cube tray works incredibly well because it really helps to keep them fresh, at least as fresh as they really can be. The herbs are very fragile, and if you've spent a lot of time seasoning your food, this isn't something I need to tell you. The essential oils in these are pretty much non-existent the moment they come into contact with air, and that only starts becoming more of a problem the longer that exposure lasts. They don't do well with lighter heat either, which is why an ice cube tray works for 3 reasons. 1, it helps preserve their freshness. Okay, tell me why, right? Well, ice cube trays put a little roadblock in a neat and slightly annoying process I affectionately call oxidation, and that really helps to keep spoilage issues low. That's all thanks to the cold temperature helping the enzymes stay away from the tissues of the herbs, and in turn, the oils that are with them. 2, there's only so much space in a tray, so you only take out the amount of herbs you need, which helps you keep spoilage to a low anyway. 3rd, you always place these trays in freezers, away from any kind of light or heat, which gives the herbs the perfect environment they need to rest and chill until you need to take them out. This one works your brain a little because it seems cartoonish in nature, but it actually works surprisingly well. Have you ever heard of cutting a cake cleanly with unscented dental floss instead of just a simple knife? While grandmas could obviously cut with both and give you a perfectly sliced cake, sometimes that pesky kitchen knife would be a bit too hard to find. Instead of rummaging through everything in the kitchen hoping to find it, what they would instead do is use the dental floss to cut through the cake. Apparently, if you had the proper technique, then it would go through like butter. Guess a lifetime of baking and cooking gives you all sorts of neat perks you can use in the kitchen, right? The idea was to wrap the dental floss around the cake and hold it tightly with both hands. Then, you would just pull in opposite directions and it would cut the middle of the cake, giving you two perfect layers. In particular, Oral-B Glide and CVS Unwaxed Floss were pretty amazing for this. When survival depended on what you could carry, one food stood out as the ultimate road snack: dried meat. Indigenous peoples of North America perfected the art of making jerky long before it became a gas station staple. Using techniques that were as practical as they were ingenious, they ensured meat could last for weeks or even months without spoiling. The preservation method was simple but effective. Thin strips of meat, often bison, deer, or elk, were cut and dried in the sun or smoked over a fire. The low moisture and high protein content made it lightweight, portable, and perfect for long journeys. Early settlers and traders quickly adopted the practice, turning jerky into a frontier favorite. Jerky's cultural roots run deep, especially among Native American communities, where it was a way to maximize resources. Every part of the animal was used, embodying a respect for nature that modern sustainability movements could learn from. With its dense nutrition and near indestructibility, jerky became a food that could outlast even the toughest trails. It wasn't gourmet, but when you're miles from civilization, chewy beats hungry every time. Another thing that people would run off fairly commonly is egg whites, and eggs were a luxury that not everyone could just choose to afford. Yet, how do you go on and start your day without one of the building blocks of American nutrition? Everything about breakfast culture in the United States has eggs taking the center stage. So what does one do? Grandmas found a neat hack where they used aquafaba instead of egg whites, and it worked out well enough too. Aquafaba is essentially liquid from things like canned chickpeas, and it can fill in for scrambled eggs if you give it a shot. 3 tablespoons of aquafaba was essentially equal to 1 egg, and a can of chickpeas could give you around 1, 2, or 3, 4 a cup of this stuff. That is a pretty good deal, and it also adds a whole new layer of detail and use to your chickpeas that was not there before. Ice water to peel eggs is really common, and I'm sure it's something you've heard of before too. See, the boiling of an egg does 2 things to the egg. 1, the protein inside the whites and the yolks comes together and really solidifies. Pretty convenient for eating purposes, but not so much for peeling ones. The heat is what makes the egg expand after all, but it also kind of means the shell sticks to the egg now. When you take that egg that was just drenched in hot water and instead put it in some ice-cold water, you create a cool little thing known as thermal shock. Have you ever been taking a really hot shower and then taken a really cold one, only to find your muscles cramping up? Yeah, that's the same concept here. The cold makes the egg contract, and pretty badly at that. It can be a pretty big pain waiting to peel all your eggs after you just waited a decent bit to boil all of them, so next time, save yourself some time, do everyone a favor, and just pour some really cold water in a glass or bowl. When settlers headed west, they didn't pack croissants or delicate pastries. Instead, they relied on a humble yet sturdy creation that could endure tough conditions and long journeys. Known as Mormon Johnny Cake, this hearty cornmeal flatbread became a cornerstone of survival for early pioneers, particularly those of the Latter-day Saints movement. Made with just a few basic ingredients, cornmeal, water, a touch of salt, and sometimes molasses, this simple bread was baked or fried on an open flame. It didn't spoil quickly, and its compact size made it easy to carry during migration across the American frontier. For preservation, dried cornmeal was a lifesaver. It could last for months if kept dry, ensuring settlers always had the means to whip up this filling staple. Culturally, the Johnny Cake symbolized resilience and resourcefulness. It wasn't luxurious, but it represented the determination to thrive under difficult circumstances. While it started as survival food, it later became a regional favorite in parts of the U.S., cementing its place in culinary history. Mormon Johnny Cake isn't exactly cake. It's more of a cross between cornbread and a pancake, proof that pioneers didn't have time for fancy names. After all, when you're blazing trails, it's the calories, not the presentation, that count. So, you're all no stranger to the concept of heat being really good at sterilizing things. That goes for pretty much every kind of food you've ever had, but it also goes for your bottles too. Why? Well, heat actually kills a lot more things than you might know. It kills pretty much any kind of bacteria, virus, and fungi. And while I'm not trying to imply you wouldn't know that, what I do think is that people, myself included, aren't aware of just how many bacteria there are on surfaces around us. Actually, the number is staggering. They all die of around 212 degrees Fahrenheit though, and that's the temperature of boiling water. This helps to completely obliterate most of these organisms on a cellular level, which is pretty metal if you ask me. The high temperature literally breaks them down into nothing, and they either become inactive because structurally they either just can't work anymore or they are outright killed. Pretty neat, right? Not only do you end up getting your water bottles sterilized, but they end up becoming as clean as they can be too. That wraps up our list for today. Comment down below which method stood out to you the most, and don't forget to like and subscribe.